I would ask just to kick off the panel, if each of you could share your role within your organization, what the organization's mission is, and importantly, what your background is in working around disaster recovery scenarios.
Hi, I'm Sonia Dua. I'm an information security manager with Doctors Without Borders, and what it does, it's all there in the news. We go around the world and save many humanitarian lives and provide them the relief from the disaster. My reporting manager here, John Ryan Brooks, will tell you a little bit more about the institutional knowledge.
I'm John Ryan Brooks. I go by JR. I'm the Director of Systems in the U.S. office for Doctors Without Borders. Our medical projects are actually run out of the our 5 main European offices. And my role now is to oversee the development of our IT portfolio in the U.S., including information security, but I also work in close conjunction with my colleagues overseas to kind of develop a more global, holistic perspective towards IT security and disaster recovery among every other possible topic and that touches technology, which is all of them. I started at MSF in 2004 working on, my background is in app development and database administration. I started working building databases, but my first real encounter with disaster recovery was when I was working in the when I started working in the field, implemented an electronic medical record system in Port-au-Prince in Haiti starting in 2008, and basically was collecting data to drive decision making, but also to prove that this new methodology for internal fixation surgery in this trauma hospital was something that could be reproduced. So this was something just like touching on something I didn't say in response to the last panel. I think the reproducibility of results is a really important part of data-driven decision making. But on the DR side, one of my jobs was to set up habits with the team about how they, at that time, we had very basic disaster recovery routines, and ours was to put the server in the filing cabinet at the end of every day. We had a very simple setup with 6 endpoints and 1 server, and that filing cabinet and that process saved that data system during the earthquake, which happened at 24 hours after my 18-month project ended in 2010. So that was like when it really woke me up to say like this stuff actually matters and it can make a big difference in terms of resiliency and also just operational impact. So that's the story that I tell internally and the one that I use as my example of how simple procedures can make a huge difference in terms of your ability to continue delivering your mission.
Cool. Tim Walton, I'm a partner technology strategist. What that means is I actually work with companies like AKA, or actually customers too, to help them build solutions on the Microsoft platform, and that's the whole platform. So it could be Office 365, Dynamics, it could be Azure. So I help them build that, mitigate any risk, and that's really my job. I've been at Microsoft for 20 years. Before that, I was actually doing day trading systems, and when you have to do disaster recovery, you really have to do it for financial companies, because if they go down more than, I think it's 5 days now, they're out of business. So a lot of experience on it, and probably DR and business continuity is probably the #1 scenario that first customers start to embrace the cloud. So that's my experience. I deal with probably about 10 different customer partners and help them succeed.
Excellent. My name is Greg Inks. I am the cloud practice lead for AKA, and what that roughly means is all things Azure, from infrastructure services to application development and native cloud building, things including the data analytics platforms of Azure, really all of the suite of the Microsoft capabilities that run in the cloud, just short of the business applications. So we have other portions inside of the company that are very responsible for the Dynamics platform and some of the other areas. My background is 100% Microsoft. Started my career in Microsoft consulting companies, even did a little bit of time working for Microsoft. And really, the focus of my entire career has been on internet scale development, applications, and infrastructure. So one of the anecdotes that I was sharing with some of the folks earlier this morning was from a non-for-profit space, one of the key disaster recovery scenarios that I remember in my mind was the development of really an internet scale website for a particular non-for-profit that supported disaster relief during natural disasters. I can't really name who that customer was because it was a different partner at the time. But the goal there was that their website was their primary vehicle of communication to people in those locations, as well as the folks that were in the field trying to serve that type of natural event and that type of natural disaster, to coordinate emergency responders, medical supply delivery, getting people to the right locations, all happening through their website. So from that standpoint, that website had to be something that was up 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with zero downtime. It just so also happened that they happened to be one of the largest attacked non-for-profits on the planet, with a lot of nefarious actors that were constantly trying to take them offline. So they were looking for a solution that could help them stand up to nefarious attacks, but also guarantee availability and uptime running. So that was one of the types of solutions that we turned to Microsoft and to the public cloud to be able to develop and deploy a website that would always run regardless of where the location was, regardless of the situation, even if a denial of service attack started to happen, be able to shut down those bad actors, but to continue to guarantee that delivery without costing the non-for-profit hundreds of thousands of dollars of infrastructure.
Thanks. That actually is a great segue into the first question I wanted to ask everybody up here, which is if you could each give us your perspective on the evolution of disaster recovery and why it's critical for nonprofit organizations today. Does anybody want to go first?
In addition to this, we have heard a lot about the field missions and the protection of data over there, but let's talk about the operational center. There is definitely a pressure of compliances on the operational centers. So maintaining that accurate data ethics and protecting the data is key to any organization missions. And as an information security program manager, I have to look into the different kind of risk metrics, but data protection is a responsibility, not just the risk metrics, and that comes with appropriate disaster recovery mechanism as well.
Yeah, so just talking a little bit about MSF, which I missed before. So MSF operates in over 70 countries. We have over 30,000 staff. But from a governance standpoint, very decentralized. We're like the perfect example of the federated, affiliated model without any, there's no top, so there's no top-down decision-making. That becomes very difficult when you're trying to establish some baseline, some standard practices around even assessing risk, much less taking action to mitigate it. So my work inside MSF, I worked on a lot of individual projects, then I was in charge of fundraising systems in the US, and then in charge of systems in the US, and now have a more global perspective. And the evolution of this conversation all comes down to, for me, operational impact. I mean, how do I make the case for investing in resources or tools, processes, people to restore or recover assets in an organization where, as you say, the places where we work, very unstable, the changes are happening every day, and we have a really good track record of working in these places with practically no disaster recovery routines in place. So the challenge for me is about how you make the case for what resiliency means and why you need it now and you didn't need it before. And I think one of the things that Sonia and I work on is really trying to take what's in place in terms of procedures, policies, and risk assessments in each country and lift it up a level to just kind of understand the commonalities and really to drive resource allocation according to risk. And that's a conversation that's hard to have in my organization in particular, because they don't see the risks around data loss as great as they see the risks around personal loss and lack of access to populations to serve. So it's complicated, but that's what we're trying to do.
Thanks.
I think if you take what JR was just saying and look at it historically speaking, you go back not even 30 years ago, to do a disaster recovery solution meant another data center, another server, another concrete physical asset that had to be acquired to be able to support these systems. And for most nonprofits 30 years ago, that was an unaffordable solution. You can't take that money out of the mission and put it into just redundant systems for what 9 times out of 10 would have been perceived to be, it's just data. We'll go back to paper and pen and we'll keep working. Our mission's more critical. Fast forward to today, everything's electronic. The ability for most non-for-profits to go back to a paper-based solution is an impractical one compared to what it was 30 years ago. But conversely, bringing the cloud, now you don't have to have a secondary data center. You don't have to have acquired all these additional assets now to be able to support a backup, an insurance policy, if you will. So I think to that question of the evolution, I think we're finally starting to reach a stage where providing that sort of a backup insurance policy to protect the mission with minimal cost is actually starting to be realized.
Okay. Tim,
Yeah, I think from my perspective, it's sort of interesting, right? If I look back when I was working on mainframes, right, it was a single point of failure, if you will. So you had to back up and do DR to another site, which was very most people can't afford to do that. However, it was easy, right? You got one place, all the data, right? You used SunGuard or wherever it was, right? Sri Lanka, I think was the first place, right? And you did the disaster recovery. It was very simple, one place. So it was very expensive. It was somewhat more simple than it is today because let's be honest, and especially looking at information and compliance right now, it's become really more complex, I think. There's a lot more compliance. There's a lot more change rate that's going through your organization, and actually your IT is spread out further. There's tools out there that make it easier, right, to actually come up with a really good business continuity plan and disaster recovery plan. But I think, I always like to go back to what you're saying. I think you need a holistic view on what is your governance and what is your strategy. And I think now that is actually, it's become clear to everybody that that's what you have to do. Previously, it was sort of a point solution, I'm good to go, right? That is a bad idea. So that's my feeling is it's cheaper, it's more economic to do it, but you've got to have a more holistic view across your whole assets that you have out there.
Fantastic. So we're hearing a little bit already that gets into my next question around kind of what are some of the drivers for why you would adopt a DR plan. And so in addition to, it sounds like it's more affordable now, it aligns, it's more achievable for nonprofits. And the question I'd have is, for each of the practitioners up here, were there particular catalysts that made your organization maybe particularly take that holistic view or, realize this is worth investing in, given that we know dollars are usually scarce within nonprofits? Or what were the main drivers that finally got the organization to adopt a DR plan?
I can give one. It's actually a company that just did not like cloud. They said we'll never be on cloud. But then compliance came out, and they had to do a compliance check on their base data center on their platform, and they were like, I don't think we can do it. We literally don't think we can actually pass the checks. So we want to essentially outsource the compliance and put it on a platform, public cloud, or maybe perhaps private cloud. And that was their motivation, right, was to be able to do that. And part of that compliance actually includes disaster recovery, right? And they simply couldn't get to that point within the time frame that they had. So I thought that was actually a flip. It used to be in the cloud, right? Everybody go, I'm not going to the cloud because I've got to be compliant and secure. And now it's sort of flipped to be like, I need to go to the cloud, help me out. How can I do this? Get these certifications, right? And I think that's made it a little bit easier. But I thought that was interesting, right? A company from saying not doing cloud to doing cloud because of compliance.
So compliance will drive you to do a lot of things, right?
I would say GDPR for one in our organization was the most powerful external driver towards maturity in many domains, but certainly IT security and technical controls and disaster recovery are one of them. It was that force that kind of started the conversation. The other driver for us internally in the U.S. was really around just some near misses. I mean, we've been so lucky that we've operated with the continuity that we have, considering our lack of the routines that we needed or the testing that we needed to really understand if our routines were effective. And it takes those near misses, or it's taken the near misses for me to say like, hey, this is why. we need to make these investments. And I mean, just one example, this is not about data loss, but it was a good example of downtime. We had migrated our Office 365, we were in our own US tenant, and we migrated to our global Office 365 tenant. And we didn't finish all of the machine endpoint configurations over the weekend, and like Monday morning, there were like 4 hours where like maybe 75% of our staff couldn't log in. And that was like a travesty. There like just so much drama. But it was temporary, and it was obviously fixed person by person, and it was just like a really good example for me on the management team to say, that was a completely controlled situation where we had a resolution, and you were going to get back exactly what you were expecting to get as soon as you were in your machine. Imagine the impact of a crippling incident where we don't have that level of clarity, where you're locked out in that same way and you simply cannot do your job. I think we have to kind of look at the reality of the operational impact, but you need the examples of like how close we came. In this case, in my case, that was the most effective way to kind of get some attention from decision makers and budget holders around the seriousness of it. And also in our decentralized governance model, even in the US, it meant that the department directors had to really start thinking about what assets, what technologies, what tools they needed to run their departments, and what it meant for them to have them, and how quickly they needed them if something went wrong.
Thanks. Thank you. Sonia, anything to add to that?
Well, I'll summarize it. Continuous availability of data to maintain the productivity is the key to drive the budgets. If the data is not available, of course, everyone gets annoyed inside the organization, and the question comes back to a small IT team which is sitting at the back end and trying to satisfy everyone's requests.
I'd be curious to show of hands of everyone in the room. For how many of your organizations is the creation of a disaster recovery plan related to your tech and databases, let's say, and websites and all that, part of a larger risk management plan for the organization? So a couple. I mean, because I would make a larger push for folks, you know, particularly if you're speaking with your COO, your CEO, if that's not you, that there's a big movement within the nonprofit sector in general right now that I think many of the really big, like $100 million agencies and above, are already doing by virtue of how big they are, but that every organization needs to have a risk management plan, and ideally an enterprise risk management plan. Some groups do or don't do that, but you know, this would fall squarely within that, so I would offer that as one way of thinking about how you also make this go above and beyond compliance, because what we find a lot in nonprofits, even outside of just the data space, is people are thinking about compliance and legal and regulatory drivers for risk management, but they're not thinking about everything related to program delivery and thinking about your staff and your board and other things that can happen on site, right, that are also part of this that may or may not relate to data, but to pull that back a little bit.
I think it's you bring up an interesting point. For a lot of other industries, you have those financial drivers or compliance drivers or regulatory drivers that are forcing you to have that business continuity plan and a disaster recovery plan, whereas in many of the non-for-profit spaces, there isn't that same level of a driver forcing you to think about what's your business continuity plan. And without somebody sort of a big brother agency looking over your shoulder, it may not be something that a lot of agencies are thinking about is, you know, what do I do if my website goes down? Is that an impactful event? Can the people that are depending upon my services still reach me? What does that look like? It's one thing to say, do we still have the ability to collect or distribute funds or food? But it's another thing of, can we even take a phone call?
Yep. No, exactly. And you can prioritize all those things as a org-wide activity.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think like a holistic, I think they call it GRC, right? Governance, risk, and compliance. It's really important. I mean, I've got an interesting story, right? I mean, normally when you're thinking about disaster recovery, right, and business continuity, you're always thinking about big applications, databases, right, that you've got to recover and get data out. Or maybe it's a SaaS application, right, like Office 365, whatever that may be. Somebody just deleted all their emails by accident, right? We had a situation where it was actually one person who had, and I was talking to somebody about this morning, that with one spreadsheet, that pretty much the whole of the licensing department at Microsoft was using. right? It had so much data in there, and everybody was accessing it, and then suddenly it wasn't there anymore. And the whole licensing department like ground to a halt because that spreadsheet moved. And sort of, if you do a risk review on certain things and what your SLAs are on certain data, right, on information itself, those things actually come out. And it's actually shocking, right? Like an IT department would say, that's not going to be on your spreadsheet anymore. We need to take that and make it more of an application, whatever that is. But it is interesting that you should start from a more holistic view, I think.
I would agree. Yeah. So I'm going to continue on the story front. For our practitioners up here, can you share examples of a DR situation where you either handled it because you had a plan in place already, or you might have learned something that forced you to do something differently going forward?
Well, there are some. We have already experienced it. So there has been a couple of suspected breaches, threats. Any organization goes through continuous attacks, especially when they are doing humanitarian kind of work or they are widely recognized. And there is always an issue with the availability of the data as well, which is pretty normal in all the IT organizations. So in terms of suspected attacks or breaches, there has been enough amount of now procedures in place where the team started getting, the network team started getting alerts from the system, and immediately the remediation was taken place. Though there was some learning curve in terms of resolving those incidents. And in addition to where we were not able to even recover some of the data, there were some remediation, there was some learning curve. So looking at the overall aspect, thanks to all the support from the executive for investing into the disaster recovery solutions, and still we are on that path and will achieve the success.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, we've been lucky. One thing we have definitely dealt with incidents, some related to single points of failure in our on-prem infrastructure that failed, where we had to get, send mail servers off to get the data recovered, and thankfully it could be, and so we have now a greater case for investing in redundant architecture. But the other thing that's happened is that each of the incidents that we've experienced, at least since I've been in my role currently, each one has been a little bit more complicated, and we've been lucky that we are maturing at the incident, the procedures, the routines around incident response are now very much ingrained, and that's helped us retain, to minimize the impact, and also to keep a focus on the most valuable, to really prioritize actions in the incident response to keep your eyes on the prize in terms of the most valuable assets that are at risk. So I would just say that, like, through our experience, the one thing that's really matured in the past 2 years is just the procedures around incident response. And that's such an important part of being effective in any kind of reactive mode to a disaster or incident of any kind.
That's great. So you're already starting to talk a little bit about what I was going to ask next, which is for AmeriCares and MSF, if you could talk through, almost like in bullet fashion, what are the core components of your DR plan? So, making sure you've got the procedures in place is one, being in the cloud is another that you've both talked about. Are there other pieces that you could just share briefly? And I'd be curious then if anyone in the audience has other things that you're doing that you'd add.
So I think it's important when you're talking about, like, if I'm speaking on behalf of the organization, our most vital assets in terms of data are around our patients. That's the core of the mission. But also we have donor data, which is obviously extremely valuable. And so the holistic perspective of how we treat disaster recovery is essential, because I can have a really good plan and procedures in place in the U.S., but if we aren't kind of singing from the same song sheet globally, then we won't really be protecting our most vital infrastructure. So I think the way that we've started, we are just starting, and I think Greg can speak to that about the way that we look at a more comprehensive business continuity plan and what that means from a disaster recovery perspective. we choose now core applications. I think this is a very common strategy for everyone, not just nonprofits, but you choose SaaS or applications that are in the cloud that are already backed up and you never ever have to worry about backing them up yourselves. But we, globally as MSF, are operating from many different, in many different contexts where we have a lot of stuff still on-prem, and that includes the US. And so the way that we're kind of addressing our plan now is around prioritization. So what are the most valuable assets, and how badly do you need them, and what's the RPO, RTO, and now AKA is helping us just say, like, this is the plan to get this into Azure. But one of the things that's really been complicated or held us up is how much, how messy our on-prem infrastructure is. Account management, meaning Active Directory account management, our domain controller configuration. These were all things where, like, we didn't want to copy the mess into the cloud. So now there's a lot of work about untangling at least the biggest, most important parts before we put it there. But that's been part of right now, that's the essence of our plan, is prioritize and then do the minimal cleaning that's required to get it into a more resilient space.
Yeah, I think to add to what JR is saying, one of the first things that I usually advise any of the customers that I'm talking to about this particular topic is that not all DR plans are duplication. In other words, you don't need to copy your entire data center and put it somewhere else to have a DR plan. Certainly, if you've got an obscene amount of money and you can afford to do that, that's the easiest solution, but that's not necessarily the most effective solution. And every system, every mission-critical business thing that you're doing has a different sort of backup procedure or a backup concept, some of which are extremely expensive, some of which are extremely dirt cheap. For the simple ability to take a backup of your system and put it somewhere else in case you happen to run out of power or get attacked or have a hardware failure, that may be a very cheap and efficient solution, but it's not necessarily the one that's going to get you back online in a few minutes. If you've got an offsite backup, it might take you a day to pull that backup back down and restore that system. On the other hand, for something that might be file retention based, and maybe you have a SharePoint instance running on premise, and you can afford to be offline with that for a day or two while you go recover those files. You don't need to go through an expensive virtualized infrastructure somewhere else, and just having an offsite backup on tape is good enough. So that disaster recovery plan, I hate to say it, does have a financial element to it that you have to have a realization, is the risk that I'm trying to mitigate worth the effort and the cost that I'm trying to put into it, and does that meet the objectives that our organization has?
And can you get the departments of business to answer that question?
That's tough.
And that's almost impossible.
Because everybody believes that their business and their solution is the most critical to the org. But from a top down, is it?
I think you can think about, just back to the larger risk management point that I was making earlier, is when you don't have that type of solution, or maybe you already invested in something else that's not in the cloud, that's an opportunity for your entire leadership team, and I would argue with folks throughout the organization, to actually pull together a risk committee and talk about what you should prioritize, because then everyone understands what matters the most and why, right? So you can prioritize that way as well.